Greetings, everyone. Putin is restless. 89,000 soldiers have died, and the nightmare of a collapsing recruitment system. Ladies and gentlemen, the Russia-Ukraine war is entering a brutal phase never before seen in modern military history. In just the first 3 months of 2026, a horrifying number has been confirmed. 89,000 Russian soldiers have vanished from the map. This is not just a statistic. It is a humanitarian tragedy and proof of a meat grinder operating at full capacity on the front lines. Every 2 days, Russia loses more soldiers than the total number of American casualties in 20 years in Afghanistan. A devastating destruction that far exceeds the limits of endurance in modern military history. The numbers don't lie. They reveal a terrifying reality. Putin's army is plunging straight into the abyss at an unstoppable pace. As the supply of mercenaries dries up and money loses its allure, Putin has begun a ruthless hunt right within his own country. From seasoned workers to students still sitting in classrooms, all are being forced to become sacrificial pawns. Russia is burning its own future in exchange for blood-soaked land, a price so steep it could cause this empire to collapse from within. Russia's invasion of Ukraine will likely go down in history as one of the most disastrous and misguided occupation attempts ever recorded. In modern military terms, that failure not only hasn't stopped, but is actually getting worse over time. Something is wiping out the Russian army on the battlefield in Ukraine at a rate never seen before, leading to a horrifying 3 months in which tens of thousands of soldiers have been lost forever in a foreign land. Russia is currently facing the largest troop losses in its modern history, right at a time when its recruitment network is showing signs of strain and collapse. The figure of 89,000 casualties in just 3 months is a shocking statistic, exposing the brutal reality of this war. This data was announced by Ukrainian President Zelensky at a press conference at the end of March, serving as evidence of everything going wrong within Russia's military machine. This means that Putin has accepted sacrificing an average of 29,666 Russian people each month since the beginning of 2026. It should be noted that January and February are still cold winter months, a time when offensive operations are often significantly slowed down due to harsh weather conditions. Normally, Russian offensive campaigns stall during the winter and only really intensify in March when the legendary spring campaign begins. Therefore, it is highly likely that the last month of the quarter is also when Russia suffers the highest confirmed casualties. This sends a grim signal that the situation will only get worse and bloodier from here on out. The craziest thing about this statistic is that even though it looks like a record for losses in 3 months, it's actually not the worst that Russia has ever experienced. From November 2025 to January 2026, Russia's losses reached nearly 100,000 people as Putin's forces tried to go all out in their effort to occupy Pokrov. In the bone-chilling cold of Ukraine, Russian troops became increasingly isolated, turning them into easy targets for Ukrainian squadrons, drones, and specialized hunter-killer units that were created specifically to break Russia's infiltration tactics. It may sound absurd, but 89,000 confirmed casualties in the first 3 months of 2026 was actually an improvement for Russia compared to the previous period. However, this improvement is insignificant when the scale of the losses is compounded by another core issue, a factor that could determine the outcome of the war behind these telling numbers. First of all, there's an important detail to note, which is the phrase confirmed. When we talk about Russia's losses in 2026, the number 89,000 is probably the most optimistic scenario for them. United 24 stated that Robert Robdy, the head of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, pointed out that up to 20% of the attacks Ukraine carried out against Russia in the first quarter of 2026 could not be verified. This does not mean that the attacks were unsuccessful. Attack drones and the dense network of reconnaissance drones in the sky provide ample evidence that the targets were all hit. The problem is that Ukraine cannot accurately count how many Russian soldiers were killed in those raids. When Ukraine strikes troop concentrations with drones, they can't record all the soldiers who are killed indirectly by shrapnel and explosions. Ukraine's numbers also don't include casualties caused by long-range attacks, shelling, or the number of Russian soldiers killed under rubble without direct video evidence. And this is when reality becomes truly grim for Russia. The amount of territory Russia has captured is decreasing inversely with the horrific casualty rate on the battlefield. The reality is that Russia hasn't done any better in this regard in the past. Looking back at 2025, Putin spent about 400,000 soldiers just to gain a mere 4,336 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That's extremely inefficient, only about 0.72% of the country's area. And Russia still has to find a way to occupy the remaining 80% of the free territory. At the current pace, Russia would need an entire century to completely subdue Ukraine. That means Putin and any aggressive successor of his will have long disappeared before the goals of the so-called special military operation are accomplished. In fact, even the prospect of a century-long war is still too optimistic for Russia, as their advance has been slowing down alarmingly since the end of 2025. According to the Institute for the Study of War, ISVK, the period from October 2025 to March 2026 shows that Russia only captured nearly 1,930 square kilometers. This number is significantly lower compared to the same period between 2024 and 2025, when Russia captured about 2,716 square kilometers. That alone shows a huge slowdown. But now we have a rough estimate of the number of casualties Russia has suffered to make those limited advances. We've mentioned the numbers, 89,000 and 100,000. There's some overlap here because January 2026 falls within both time periods. If we remove the overlap, we have a total of 184,000 casualties for the 6-month period that ISVK reported. When dividing 184,000 casualties by the territory captured, Putin will have to face a harsh reality that he can hardly accept. Russia is losing nearly 247 soldiers for every square mile of Ukrainian territory gained. This is a generational loss for the entire Russian population for only tiny gains in territory, and this is starting to weigh heavily on the Russian military. It's hard to believe, but this casualty pressure shows no signs of stopping. Any hope Putin has that the casualty rate will slow down in 2026 is just wishful thinking. Russia has launched its spring offensive, which means the assaults are happening with greater intensity than at any other time of the year. With more attacks, casualties are sure to skyrocket. We saw that on March 17, when Russia broke the 2026 record for losses with 1,710 soldiers taken out of action in just 24 hours. Along with that was the loss of 230 military vehicles and trucks, as well as 29 artillery systems. This number shows a sharp increase compared to the daily losses of 700 to 900 people that Russia suffered earlier this year. To better understand the scale of this tragedy, let's look at a harsh comparison. Currently, every 2 days, the number of Russian soldiers killed exceeds the total losses of the U.S. military during 2 decades of fighting in Afghanistan. Even when compared to their own history, to the Afghan war where the Soviet Union was bogged down and lost 15,000 troops over a decade, now in Ukraine, an equivalent number has been wiped out in just half a month. This is an absurd and bitter statistic, exposing the reality that although Putin always worships the glory of the old Soviet era, he is running a war that is far more disastrous than his predecessors. 89,000 lives have been wiped off the map in just the first 3 months of 2026 in exchange for pieces of territory so small they're hardly worth mentioning. As the spring campaign erupts, Russia is sitting on a powder keg of new ambitions, ready to explode right in front of the Kremlin. However, behind those deadly numbers lies an even more troubling issue, a bottleneck that could turn the catastrophe into the end of Putin's ambitions. The real issue is not just that thousands of soldiers are dying every day, but that this is the first time since the invasion began. Russia is failing to recruit enough troops to fill the vast gaps on the battlefield. According to reports from United 24, the balance between those joining and those leaving the Russian military has been negative for 4 consecutive months, from December 2025 to March 2026. This means that the number of soldiers being taken out of action far exceeds the system's ability to mobilize new recruits. Russia has only achieved 22% of its recruitment target, while it should have been 25% to maintain momentum, making the target number 409,000 troops for Russia. The 2026 target becomes far-fetched and unrealistic. It should be emphasized that 89,000 casualties is only the confirmed number. which means in reality, this figure could be thousands or even tens of thousands higher. In that context, Ukraine still shows no sign of stopping as President Zelensky sets a goal to inflict losses of up to 50,000 Russian troops per month by the end of 2026. This is an ambitious vision, but it is entirely feasible as the intensity of the fighting continues to escalate. What we are seeing is the highest level of endurance that Russia can hope for, but even that level has already exceeded their ability to replenish their troops. The method of recruiting volunteers by using huge sums of money to entice the poor to go to the front lines has now lost its effectiveness, forcing the Kremlin to resort to more extreme and desperate measures. A situation that seems to exist only in satirical stories is happening in the Vyazan region, where the local governor is requiring businesses to directly participate in the process of sacrificing manpower. Companies with between 150 and 500 employees are being forced to make lists of people to send straight to the front lines before September. Businesses that refuse to comply will face heavy fines of up to 1 million rubles. It doesn't stop there. The future of the country is also being put at risk as Minister of Education and Science. Valery Fankov has ordered universities to persuade at least 2% of their students to sign military enlistment contracts. This is a desperate covert mobilization order, showing Putin is sacrificing a future generation to salvage a stalled military campaign. The price to pay for this madness is a vicious cycle of recession with no way out for the Russian economy. The severe labor crisis is strangling industries as the war machine consumes all available human resources. In the Leningrad region, more than 20 major factories have had to switch to working only 3 days a week due to a shortage of labor and orders. Putin is creating a self-destructive cycle, draining labor from factories and farms to throw into the flames of war, causing other economic sectors to collapse, and ultimately leaving people with no choice but to serve the war machine in order to survive. By sacrificing students and skilled workers, Putin is destroying Russia's post-war foundation just to gain short-term stopgap measures for the problem of manpower shortages. Not stopping at forcing workers and students, Putin is getting closer than ever to issuing a nationwide full-scale mobilization order. All preparations began in 2025 when a new law was passed, turning the conscription system from 2 annual rounds into a year-round mechanism, allowing anyone aged 18 to 30 to be drafted at any time. Although Russia has always claimed it would not send conscripts to Ukraine, promises from the Kremlin have never really carried any weight. All conscripted soldiers will become a reserve force, ready to be thrown into combat units when necessary. The failure of voluntary recruitment campaigns is pushing Putin down a path he has always wanted to avoid, turning voluntary enlistment into a forced mobilization order. A limited reserve mobilization plan is being urgently prepared, even though this is a risky political gamble that Putin once feared after the intense wave of protests in September 2022. The preparations for a new mobilization order are essentially a tacit admission that the so-called special military operation is not proceeding in a way that leads to victory. Putin is not concerned about the lives of Russian people, but he clearly understands that the outrage from a new mobilization order could become a specter that directly threatens the seat of power he has spent a quarter of a century protecting. But if Putin still wants to maintain this invasion, especially as Ukraine is dispersing Russian military units faster than ever, then he really has no other choice. The supply of former prisoners, convicts once sent to the front lines for freedom, is now exhausted. And for the volunteer forces, the registration rate is at a record low. Russia also no longer has enough financial resources to maintain the lucrative rewards used to entice people to take up arms. The territories that have been forced to fund this campaign, as Zia San mentioned above, are beginning to go bankrupt. The huge bonuses that once reached up to $40,000 in some areas are now just a thing of the past. The Key Post reports that enlistment bonuses are being cut across many regions, simply because these regions need money to maintain other essential needs instead of continuing to throw it into Putin's war furnace. As a result of compounding mistakes, Ukraine has now become a more effective machine for destroying the Russian army than ever before. The area is already filled with drones, which have long been a source of terror for Russian soldiers, have now tripled in scale thanks to the arrival of new mid-range attack drones. By the end of 2025, Ukraine had reached the capacity to produce 4 million drones per year, ensuring that these areas will never be without the ghosts in the sky. Right in the heart of Russia, Ukraine's long-range raids are devastating oil refineries, export ports, and key military hubs. This not only weakens the Russian military fighting in the war, but also deals a heavy blow to the Kremlin's already tight cash flow. The collapse is happening from the rear all the way to the deadly front lines. As the spring campaign accelerates, this tragedy will only worsen. The numbers in March say it all. In just the 4 days before March 23, Russia carried out more than 600 frenzied attacks, and the price was 6,090 soldiers killed, according to a report by the Kyiv Independent. On average, more than 1,522 Russian soldiers fell each day, and this is just the prelude to what is coming. If you multiply this number by 30 days, the monthly losses will reach 46,000 people. This number is approaching the threshold of 50,000 casualties per month, a level of attrition that Ukraine believes will force Putin to end the war because he cannot endure anymore. The Russian leader is heading straight toward the abyss at a terrifying speed, just as the conscription system is falling apart. Clearly, no country can sustain a war at such an expensive and unreasonable cost. 89,000 casualties confirmed in 3 months is undeniable proof. But it seems that Putin is still blinded by his mad military ambitions, unable to see the harsh reality in front of him. And never make the mistake of thinking that Ukraine will stop. They are constantly coming up with new and more sophisticated ways to turn the tide on the battlefield. Even the strategy of using long-range drones, one of the Kremlin's few remaining hopes, is being countered by a modern weapon. And in your opinion, with a casualty rate of nearly 50,000 people per month, could a full-scale mobilization order in Russia lead to political upheaval right inside the Kremlin?